with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, August 7th, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Micha Frazer-Carroll, columnist at The Independent, author of Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health. Also on the program today, Donald Trump seeking a more white venue for his conspiracy trial.
Intellectual diversity.
The most white venue.
Meanwhile, prosecutors ask the judge for a protective order from Donald Trump's inciting posts on Truth Social.
Free speech.
Fifth Circuit finds lifetime voting bans for ex-felons to be unconstitutional under the cruel and unusual prohibition. State court finds Texas abortion ban to be too restrictive. Republican group sues the Biden administration to stop loan cancellation for 800,000 people, but could completely undermine the Department of Education's ability to cancel any student debt. Biden expected to permanently ban Grand Canyon mining. UAW negotiations coming to a head as a strike looms. Meanwhile, nothing comes of the WGA AMPTP meeting, as actors and writers are still on the picket lines. And a Republican right-wing darling, Richard Hanania. Did I say that right?
Sure.
Whatever. Turns out to be a secret-ish Nazi-nia.
So those are the people you expect.
Israeli National Security Chief calls settlers suspected of murder heroes in a Praise for Slay program. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us at the beginning of a week in August.
Was that supposed to be Nazi? Nazinia?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I tried to draw a parallel between his last name, Hanania. Am I saying that wrong?
Nazinia.
I always thought it was Hanania, but
I mean, Hanania.
like inane.
The idea that I can just get the number of syllables correct is a huge achievement for me. And then I tried to sort of create a parallel with the secret-ish Nazi-nia.
It's better than Glenn Greenwald tried to pronounce Ocho Cinco on his show, which Bradley sent to me earlier. We can play that later potentially. So you fared
I would
better.
not want to get into any type of competition about pronouncing people's names or words. I'm not going to do that. That's like, I might as well. I don't know what else I could be worse at.
It's like challenging Usain Bolt to a sprint match.
Yes. I mean,
Sprint
that would
match?
be,
Yeah.
sprint match. Classic sprint match.
Tune into ESPN.
Let's get to this. We've got a lot to cover today. I should say this is it's a little bit of a crazy week for me. Daughter's birthday. She's starting to get ready to go to college, and I didn't realize that she would be going around this time, and we got a vacation, and it's things are a little bit nuts. So bear with us. But
I remember driving to college as a freshman, like with my car all loaded up and everything. That's wild.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it seems
well,
like yesterday.
Mila is not going to get a car, and so we'll be taking her. much to her chagrin, she is not. She is asked on multiple occasions.
I poured salt in the wound there. Sorry, Milo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said it is possible that she will get a car, but probably not when she's in college. I mean, she might.
Right.
We'll see, because the Sub is about to hit. It's starting to go into 100,000 miles, and I'm more like around you give the kid the car around 150,000 miles type
all
of
right.
guy. But we'll see.
Miles, it's time to start doing donuts in the parking lot.
Exactly.
Drive up that mileage.
Well, fortunately, it has all-wheel drive, so she can't do that. All right, let's get into this. Was it on Friday? What day was it? I guess it was Friday. Donald Trump, we played a clip of Donald Trump walking out of his limo as he's about to leave Washington after he's been indicted. And the first thing he does when he comes up to the microphone is he says, this place is garbage. It's dirty, infested, Washington, D.C., decrepit.
Yeah.
And
So much worse than when I was here.
I speculated at the time, this is part of the defense strategy. They're going to start to, and let's be clear. The defense strategy is ultimately, I must get elected president so that I can figure out a way of ending the appeal that would be on me in terms of the timing. Okay. I actually spoke to a former U.S. attorney the other day about this in terms of the timing, and he thinks it's going to go maybe pretty quick. And the real question is going to be whether Trump is allowed out on bail.
Wow.
But I'm more convinced that he will be let out on bail. With all that said, so that's the overriding strategy that Trump has, right? Where it's, I need to get elected. And part of that, which dovetails with his criminal defense strategy, which is really, again, his primary criminal defense strategy is get elected president and end this prosecution. He's going to claim, we said after that moment when he got in front of the microphone, because that was planned. Let's be clear. That wasn't just him shooting off the cuff. That they're going to argue he can't get a fair trial because there's too many black people in Washington, D.C., and the judge is a black woman. And, that was my sort of just speculation. And, ladies and gentlemen, 3 days later on Face the Nation, his attorney, 2 days later, had this to say.
I can tell you that in 40 years of practicing law, on a case of this magnitude, I've not known a single case to go to trial before 2 or 3 years.
Understood. Are you still going to pursue a change of venue?
Absolutely. We would like a diverse venue, a diverse jury.
Do you have any expectation that will be granted?
That reflects the characteristics of the American people. It's up to the judge. I think West Virginia would be an excellent venue to try this case.
Speaking of the judge,
to D.C. and a much more diverse.
Understood. Speaking of the judge, earlier this week, your client, the former president.
First off,
follow up, please.
Speaking of arrested, Major Garrett should get arrested.
Good
is
Lord.
it really irrelevant anything that your guest says because you've had your written out questions?
Yeah, why not just send him a questionnaire if you're not going to respond to anything?
It's so ridiculous.
I mean, what do you mean by diverse? What do you mean by diverse?
Understood,
is the
sir.
easiest follow up. Because clearly, if we're talking about racial diversity, West Virginia would not be the place to go, one of the whitest states in the country.
Well, what is it about West Virginia that is diverse? there's been a lot of things I've heard about West Virginia described. They're not racial. One can only imagine. But a more diverse jury in one of, if not the, probably one of, definitely one of, the whitest states in the country.
Top 5, definitely.
And certainly one of the most sort of conservative states in the country as well. And it is just laughable. And frankly, they know they're not going to get this venue change. It's absurd. And because to acquiesce to their venue change, you're going to have to argue that there's something fundamentally un-American about the people who live in the capital city. of the country.
There is something un-American about it in the fact that they really don't have any representation, but I don't think that's what they're referring to.
That's true. We want to change in venue to protest the failure of Congress to make them a state. But this is this is what we're going to hear. And it's just going to get worse. People should be, ready for this, because this is literally an existential threat to Donald Trump as far as he's concerned. He needs to win the presidency to stay out of jail. That is what he is convinced of. No one can see into the future, but that is a reasonable conclusion for him to make.
He was already talking about preemptively pardoning himself, there were rumors that was being discussed before, obviously, he was forced out of office on January 20th.
Yeah, because nobody knows, if you could offer a preemptive pardon on what.
It's unprecedented.
And but this is existential for him. So it's going to start with this, but look at how it's ramped up in just 2 days. They're getting more and more explicit. If Major Garrett was not so tied to the questions in front of him, he might have said, "What makes West Virginia more diverse? Can you explain this to me?"
Yeah. And by the way, Trump has tried this before. If you recall, was it about the wall, or was it about some of his other immigration policies? I forget. But there was a judge assigned who had Hispanic or what was it?
He was Mexican, yeah.
Mexican.
Well, no, he wasn't Mexican. I mean, his parents,
right.
He was of Mexican descent.
And it was litigation related to the wall, and he was saying how he couldn't get a fair trial in that. In that case, never mind the fact that the documents trial is an appointee of his, and she's clearly ruling in his favor and has before. That's not rigged at all.
It wasn't even the wall, which you would think because he attacked Judge Gonzalo Curiel, but that was over a Trump University San Diego fraud case.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Mexicans
don't Mexicans don't like fraud. Completely biased against fraud.
Everybody knows this.
We'll be talking to Micha Frazer-Carroll, a columnist at The Independent, author of A Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health, in just a minute. But first, a word from one of our listeners who started a leftist-owned worker collective called IAC Laser Engraving. Ryan Lubin started this in September of 2021. His company is democratically structured, ensure that any hierarchies are justified and efficient. They use sustainably sourced materials coupled with extremely energy efficient laser technology to bring you some really unique gifts and products and puzzles and whatnot, stuff you will not find anywhere else. Your purchase of their items not only gets you a one-of-a-kind product, but it also goes directly into supporting a business model that is structured around compassionate and worker-centered care, as opposed to the more traditional and predatory, authoritarian, capitalist businesses that are all around us. You've seen stuff in the past, like we've had puzzles, and I'm looking at that owl and the Sasquatch. And Saul has an astronaut in his room now. These two may be two of my favorites. I love the astronaut too, but this first is a fox.
I haven't seen that one yet.
No,
wow.
The painting is really what is doing this for me. Fox has 5 hand-painted, hand-glued layers. I don't know if you can see how, the depth of this. It's layered. And the 3-dimensional design inside provides an endless amount of detail. You're going to notice something different every time you look at this. It's available on their website for only $75. And it makes the perfect addition to your home, or a great gift for your loved ones, or maybe, if you are lucky, your dorm room. Mila?
Ooh.
I'm not promising anything. Although, this I think is my absolute favorite. This one just it feels like summer to me. This is a honeycomb. It is a 9-layer design, as you can see, dripping with awesomeness. You can get this honeycomb from IAC Lasers, available for only $75 at IACLasers.com. Also, don't forget, they do puzzles, but even better, they do custom puzzles. So if it's like somebody's anniversary, or I don't know, somebody's birthday, or you got a couple of cats that you love, or it could be dogs,
Or that.
I don't know, any type of animal. You send them a picture, they will turn it into a custom wooden puzzle in a custom engraved wooden box. Beautiful stuff. As always, visit IAClasers.com. Use the coupon code majority10 at checkout. You will save 10% on your order. They've also updated their site recently, so if you visited in the past, you want to visit again, check out all the new products. Again, that's IAClasers.com. Use the coupon code majority10. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Micha Frazer-Carroll, columnist at The Independent, author of Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. It's a real pleasure to welcome to the program Micha Frazer-Carroll. She is a columnist at The Independent, author of Mad World, Politics of Mental Health. Micha, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your book basically, I mean, it does a lot of things. It gives a history of how we have treated broadly. I mean, a lot of it's focused obviously on England, mental health, and then goes into sort of like sort of defining, or examining how we define mental health, and all of the sort of, I guess, the complications associated with that and the implications of diagnosis, all set, in the backed up of the sort of capitalist system that we work in. Let's just start though with, and also we should say you have a personal story as well as to this. Why don't we start actually there a little bit with like how you came to this topic, and how you came to the understanding of this topic through your own personal experience.
Yeah, definitely. So this is something I grappled with a bit with this book, because I felt, to what extent do you put yourself in your own work when you're writing about politics? But I did think it felt really important to kind of locate the position, like, where am I speaking from? What's my experience? How did I come to this? And for me, I had an experience of dissociation, which is sometimes the type I experience, sometimes called depersonalization, which sounds really weird, but basically I woke up one day and I kind of felt like I wasn't real. And it's a bit like, when something really stressful or traumatic happens and you're like, oh, I feel like a bit out of my body, or like, I don't quite remember, like it kind of went by in a blur. It was like that, but it was kind of 24/7 and ended up lasting for a number of months. And it sounds very poetic and metaphorical, but I experienced things like I would look in the mirror and genuinely feel like I didn't recognize myself. I didn't feel like it was me. My memory was kind of all weird. I felt like I couldn't really tell the difference between dreams and real life, things like that. So it was quite a kind of dream state. And like I said, it went on for a really long time. And it's only when I started to do a bit of kind of research and kind of typing in things like, I don't feel real on the internet, that I discovered that there's a name for it, and that other people experience it too, and that actually it's quite closely related to really, really high anxiety levels. So that was kind of an interesting experience for me in understanding how a label or a diagnosis in some ways can give you greater understanding or kind of bring you together with other people who had like a similar experience. And I think after this mental health crisis, I became, I think, quite interested in the social and political dimensions of both my experience, but I was also a student at university at the time. And, it's that's a very stressful time in life for a lot of people. And a lot of students around me were also experiencing mental health problems. And increasingly, I kind of thought I wanted to draw on both what I went through and the people around me were going through. And started doing some kind of journalism. I started up a magazine, which was on the topic of mental health, and also doing some kind of student organizing around mental health. So that's my entry point.
Well, and one of the interesting things about, the things that I think one of the reasons why we wanted you on the show was that this is, in part anyways, an argument that that mental health should be more politicized. And was that your initial, did you come to that notion of what was the process of it going from, this is something I'm personally experiencing, to this is actually a greater political issue in the context of our society?
Mm-hmm. I think it was kind of a complicated journey. I think often when we look back on our memories and life experiences, you might kind of have an inkling of the kind of story that surrounds it. But obviously when we look back, we kind of sometimes go over the story or kind of create or understand new stories around what happened. And I think it was probably the year or so following that I looked back and I realized that, in my personal life, I was experiencing quite a few different traumatic things at the time. I was quite isolated, as a lot of students are. I think I didn't have much of a caring community. And I think also the structures that surrounded me, at university, it was this thing of, you constantly have to be working, you've got essay deadlines, every 10 minutes, it was a really stressful time in life. And I think that I started to kind of look back. And I think it was also maybe my experiences, as a person of color. I was living in a very white city. And experiencing racism as well. I think when I started to look back, I kind of more clearly understood what were actually all of the stresses that were surrounding me during this experience. And I think the story that I now kind of understand for myself is that those stresses were really contributing to kind of my experience of mental distress. And that's something that's very kind of well evidenced with depersonalization, is that it's closely correlated with stress, trauma, and things like this.
And we should say the sort of, at least parts of the catalysts associated with this are political issues. And then, so it's both on the sort of the generation in terms of generating these problems, but also on the resolution. There are political issues on both sides of it, as well as situated in the middle of how you're categorized and how you're stigmatized and how you're treated by society at that time. Let's go back and just give us a little bit of history as to how the development of all this, and to the extent that you can, how much of it is paralleled in the United States. It doesn't necessarily match up. Obviously, your healthcare system is very different, or at least the delivery of it, and the access to it is very different than it is over here, but in some ways there's some consistencies, unfortunate ones probably.
Definitely. And I'm so glad that you bring capitalism into the room, because this is, a really central argument that I make in my book, that the capitalist economic system is really inextricably intertwined with our mental health and our experiences of treatment. And one way I tried to trace this, like you mentioned, is by looking at the history of mental health. Specifically, I look at it in the UK, partly because the UK is where the world's first asylum was, what they used to call lunatic asylums. And it is quite strange that a lot of this history is paralleled very closely in the US, the development of asylums. So basically, kind of before the Industrial Revolution and the dawn of capitalism, a lot of people who experienced what was then called madness were people who were integrated in the local community. They were often cared for by their families or other community members, and they were often given kind of money to also, for their families to look after them in the home. But then when you see capitalism emerging, you get lots of people obviously being pushed into factories and factory work. In England, we had the introduction of something called the Poor Laws, which took away that money that allowed for people to be cared for in the community. And you also got people who were unemployed pushed into like workhouses and institutions like this and kind of forced to work when previously they would have been unemployed. And so this kind of fractured this community-based kind of way of living and meant that people became very atomized and people couldn't kind of stay in the home and look after their relatives who would have been called mad at the time. And so when you get people being sent into work like this and money being stripped away, one of the outcomes of this is, well, what do you do with the people who were previously like needed to be cared for kind of full time in the home? They need somewhere to go. And that's when we see kind of this huge expansion and explosion in numbers of people being admitted to asylums. And if you look at the history, like some of the reasons that people were admitted to asylums are also really dubious and really political. You know, you have people in the records being admitted for things like politics, novel reading, hatred of spouse, things like this. And I think that points towards how who we think of as being mad or sane is also like, it always sits within a political context. But yeah, so you get lots of people being sent into asylums into kind of the 20th century. And then I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about neoliberalism, but when we see kind of the dawn of neoliberalism, we see, you know, politicians like in the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher. In the US, it was Reagan, who really pioneered the closure of these institutions, which many people, you know, we can look back and say in many ways, deinstitutionalization and releasing people back into the community is in many ways a good thing. But actually, obviously, these politicians didn't really care about the well-being of people. They cared about.
I mean, that is, I mean, for me, having grown up in that era, the Reagan era, I just remember that it's a classic. It's a two-part process. It's just, we're just going to do the first part.
Can I just ask before we move to the second part, how gendered were these initial institutionalizations? How did they fall along racial lines as well, I guess, from your perspective in the UK?
Mm-hmm. So in the UK, I guess like our system, you know, the way that colonialism operated, lots of Black people would have been in the Caribbean rather than in the UK. But there were trends, for example, and this also is mirrored in the US, of, you know, there was a diagnosis called drapetomania, which was suggested to be applied to Black people. And the symptom was running away from the plantation. And so obviously you can see again that this is a very racialized category, entirely shaped by kind of the political expectations of Black people at the time. But women being incarcerated in asylums was very common. You know, you saw a lot of spouses sending their wives to asylums. You could be admitted for reasons like not wanting to have children or not being, you know, the right kind of woman. Hysteria obviously was a really gendered category. So yeah, it did very much operate along these lines.
I just want to get like, you know, if you can maybe just talk a little bit about the sequencing. You open the asylums because as basically as a form of social reproduction, right? Like we can't get workers if they are bound at home to care for people who maybe they've got to keep an eye on, one of the kids or one of the cousins or one of the uncles or grandpa, whatever it is. And so that's a function of social reproduction. But now you have these asylums there and essentially a new filtering system of determining who is, you know, normal. And that filtering system is how productive can you be in this new sort of context? I mean, so like the drapetomania, which is essentially like you don't want to be a slave anymore, or you're actively fighting against being a slave, seems to me to be also, I mean, in addition to just in and of itself being, you know, completely a huge indictment on how, you know, mental health is applied in this context. But it also is like, you know, one of those sort of like extreme examples of if you can't work or you're stressed under work or you don't like going into work, at one point, like you become a non-productive member of society in a way that it's very easy to label you as having some type of mental disorder. And you go like, how much of that, were there waves of the way that the, sort of madness was applied?
Absolutely. I think you touched on so many important points, the point of social reproduction. So like there were different trends in how psychiatrists or people who kind of worked at these asylums, how they tried to approach and categorize madness and how they tried to treat it as well. So there was a big wave kind of towards the end of in the 19th century, which was called moral treatment. And the idea of moral treatment centered around, actually, maybe we need to get people to like occupy themselves and to occupy their minds and to therefore work more. And so you have lots of people kind of producing toys, shoes, books, things like this. And we still see this, right, in like the prison system as well today, people being forced into labor. And this was seen as kind of a potential cure. Obviously, that didn't really work very well for most people. For various reasons, that system kind of collapsed. But you see subtly again this idea that the definition of sanity or being healthy is so closely tied to being able to work and be exploited. And you also see, when we look at the 20th century, we see this kind of back and forth between biological approaches, social approaches, biological approaches, but kind of a uniting trend that comes up again towards the end of the 20th century is there was this big kind of biological resurgence and revolution in terms of how psychiatry approached mental health. And so they kind of went from this more psychoanalysis-based way of thinking about it to this really kind of disorder, individual illness, like it's a biological problem approach. And around this time, you kind of start to see symptoms and things creeping in to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the manual they use to diagnose mental illness. You see the current edition we have mentions work almost 300 times. And so you can see being able to work, and you'll see this with diagnoses like depression, for example. One of the number one things is, does it interfere with your ability to go to work, to go to school, to go about your daily life? And so you see that work kind of is one of the central kind of principles under which we decide what health is and what illness is. And you see this as well in treatment today. So as you point out, you've got the people who are just warehoused in separate places because society's kind of decided you are not going to be a viable, exploitable worker. And then you've also got, a lot of the treatments that we have in the UK, for example, you are going to get the cheapest possible treatment when you go to our healthcare system. So that will probably be medication, or you might get CBT. And both of these approaches, they're not very person-centered in the way that they're actually enacted. They're basically asking, can we get you back to a position where you can go into work? And you see, people who are in the benefits and system and stuff, sometimes being kind of pushed into going to therapy and things like this to basically get you back on the production line, which is often the place that's actually making us unwell in the first place.
What about those kind of like secondary methods of enforcing social reproduction in the way that, say, homosexuality during the 20th century was it kind of roped into these diagnoses of mental disorders and health and things like that? And I think you can draw some parallels to now with I guess gender dysphoria is now the outdated term, but that's not so distant, right? I mean, that was still being used in the previous DSM, whatever, before it was just updated.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is something that I look at quite a bit in the book, In the mid-20th century, when you've got, the civil rights movement, you've also got the gay rights movement, you see a lot of people, these movements also starting to become critical of psychiatry and how kind of people are categorized as orderly or disorderly. And there was obviously a big push in the gay rights movement in the 1960s towards depathologizing homosexuality. And I think we often look back on this as like a straightforward kind of like, this is one of the biggest victories of the movement, homosexuality no longer being categorized as an illness. But I think it's really important to also look at, okay, what happened when this took place? So this took place during a time where, like I said, psychiatry was being really widely criticized across society. And at that moment, the American Psychiatric Association basically took a vote under this pressure and said, okay, we'll take homosexuality out. It's no longer an illness. That was kind of a blip. That was a mistake. But when that happens, you obviously still have transgender people still being categorized as ill. And so by kind of removing homosexuality, you also simultaneously almost kind of solidify the idea that, okay, but this being trans is a kind of objective disorder or illness.
It's like a limited hangout almost on some level.
Exactly. And so I think I try to be critical of kind of these arguments that you see a lot of kind of when you look at like archival material from the time, is people being like, we're not mad, we're not sick, we're normal, like we should be assimilated into society. And I think that when we look at these arguments, we should think, well, kind of who are you throwing under the bus when you do that? And I think that, like you say, like the ongoing pathologization of trans people, I think in some ways is a bit of a legacy of the way that kind of that move was enacted. And yeah, the fact that like most trans people I know in the UK have to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, usually by a psychiatrist, if you want to access gender affirming healthcare. So yeah, that's a form of pathologization that still continues.
I want to get back, and I think this intersects a little bit with what you were just talking to, but to that point where you said like there at various times the diagnoses of being mad in whatever form it is sort of like shifted from social to biological and back and forth, like what influenced the ebb and flow of that? Right? Like, I mean, you mentioned drapetomania. There was also like a protest psychosis during that era that you were just talking about, the civil rights era, like which I guess presumably is like you're caught up in the mania of protest, and you've gone mad with protest fever. But like, how did that track the needs of either the entire system in terms of capitalism, or was it also sort of like tied to, so-called innovation? Like things became a lot more biological when Pfizer stumbled on, X, Y, or Z drug, and then all of a sudden everything downstream from there became biological, and so it sold a lot of drugs. Like how does that track?
I think it's a really good question, and it's really complicated, actually. It's something that I feel like I didn't like craft like a very clear, like, okay, this is it, this is the answer when you look at the history, because you do see a lot of kind of like infighting within like mental health professionals, and you see it like dating all the way back to like the 18th century, people being like, okay, no, what we, it's the four humors, it's about bile and phlegm and things like this, and that led to a lot of kind of really brutal treatments. And then you kind of see that approach failing. And as that approach fails, you see this kind of alternative movement spring up, which, these professionals were arguing, actually, this is a kinder approach, this moral treatment that I described of, we just need to get people into work. This is the kinder way to do things. And then I think, you're right to kind of tie it to kind of currents more broadly in science and kind of broader society. Obviously, towards the end of the 19th century, you get the eugenics movement. That was very much seen as a way of kind of proving things as legitimate objective truth and objective science, and about kind of advancement of the human race, etc. And around that time, you get, psychiatrists who were very much trying to prove that psychiatry was a legitimate science like any other. And so then you get this big push towards, treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, really invasive medications and things like this, and, lobotomies, people saying it's about the brain. But I also think you can look at other trends and historical currents, for example, during the Second World War, lots of people, asylum residents, were also killed during the Holocaust under the Nazis' Action T4 program. I think it's somewhere between 70 and 100% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia in Germany were killed or sterilized. And so after the Second World War, there was also a bit more of a turn towards, psychoanalysis, Freud, these more social approaches. But I do think kind of the biological turn that we've had towards the end of the 20th century is very associated with neoliberalism. But I wouldn't say that biological approaches are the only ones that are possible under neoliberalism, because we see now kind of this idea, everyone should be going to therapy. Everyone needs to be doing their mindfulness. It's your individual responsibility to go to yoga or do journaling or self-care or whatever it is. So I think it's kind of this push and pull throughout history, but you see both approaches getting weaponized under neoliberal capitalism.
Well, I really wanted to ask you about that because right now, I mean, we've talked about this on this program, the ubiquity of mental health awareness. I mean, I feel like we've reached peak awareness about the term mental health, right? But awareness is wildly insufficient without care, and particularly in the United States, where we do not have any socialized healthcare for the general population. That is a major problem. It is about access and affordability as opposed to awareness. And so I'm curious what your take is on like the overall PSA campaign that's both been undergone by politicians and like corporate entities like the NFL, for example.
Okay, yeah. I think, like you say, we are at peak awareness. We're all very aware. And I think this is something that we should really question, this idea. Firstly, awareness, when we talk about it, so often, who does the responsibility fall on to make everyone aware? We often see these ideas like we all need to speak out and break the stigma, which is actually placing responsibility on the very people who are suffering to speak out. And I think also like speaking out, we don't all have equal access to doing that. We often see, right, like the praising of, say, celebrities or people who, open up about their struggles. But, in the book I take, for example, if you're a single mother and you open up about, your schizophrenia diagnosis, you might have your children taken away. You might be institutionalized. Like, we don't all have equal access to this. And I think it's kind of messed up to imply that, if we all just speak out, that's kind of going to solve this widespread mental health crisis that we're seeing. But I think also when we talk about awareness, we very rarely question kind of the insidious suggestion, like aware of what? Like, I think when we talk about everyone should be aware of this thing or that thing, we don't necessarily question the knowledge that's being circulated as objective truth. And this knowledge is often, the idea that it's individual illness or, you've just got a chemical imbalance and things like this, which is not always going to lead to a very social or political, robust understanding of where suffering often actually comes from. And so I try to kind of really critique this idea of awareness and actually say, well, it is possible, I've learned a lot from these like kind of awareness conversations. I don't think that they're straightforwardly negative, but I think that acting as if that's the be all and end all, I don't think is going to lead us towards actual political change. And I don't think it leads us towards liberation.
Is there a tension in that we address these problems all exclusively as a psychological problem, right? I mean, in as opposed to there's a whole cohort of people who are responding in a similar fashion to the context in which they're in. Maybe the problem is the context. Mm-hmm. I mean, someone once like accused me of like of trying to. There's some I think it's a Buddhist saying about protecting your feet by putting leather all around the planet versus putting some leather on your shoes. But the problem with something like that is, what if everybody's having to put leather on their shoes and we can actually control just how sharp the ground is I mean, the ground is being made sharp because it behooves a certain class of people to have it be sharp because maybe they're selling shoes. And so I guess the point being, like, how problematic is that? There's been this sort of, like, this battle between maybe sociology and psychology.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really problematic. I think, like you say, there's this idea that, you're the problem. You need to change something about yourself. This could be through biological means, through like things like meds, but it also can be through social means, things like therapy and mindfulness that I mentioned. And while many of these things, like, they can be healing for us, they can be good for us. Like, I think it would be dishonest to kind of pretend that these things can't be paths to healing. The exclusive focus on these individual remedies so often completely obscures the political causes of mass distress. Like, I would say, like, the majority of distress, and also, a large amount of physical illness as well. I think you can extend the arguments to physical illness. You can ask, why are so many people getting in London getting asthma in kind of, the crowded city conditions that we live in? Why do so many people, are they developing heart disease? Things like this, which again are very political as well, like they're tied to the political world. And, the cultural theorist Mark Fisher talks about this thing. He describes, you got privatization under neoliberalism, but he has this concept called the privatization of stress, where he says, actually, under neoliberal capitalism, we have individualized this idea of, it's stress, it's individual, it's not kind of a social political problem. And there's some really interesting research by the journalist Tim Adams, where in the UK, he looks at the number of strike days, which reached kind of their peak in the 1970s and then kind of became decimated under Margaret Thatcher. And he says, as the number of strike days decrease, you see an increase in the number of what are called stress-related sick days. And so you can see right there this kind of shift from a more political and bigger structural analysis to an individual one, which is solely focused on, this idea that you're the problem and you need to change something about yourself. And as we've mentioned, usually that is realigning yourself, your body or your mind, back in line with the demands of the market.
How much, I mean, as I sort of wonder this, I sort of trying to compare it to the idea of, like, well, if our healthcare system is dealing with asthma and it's increasing, then it starts to move into, like, sort of a public policy question. Same with obesity in this country. Like, what are the public policy things that are creating this, and do we have a public policy answer? Is there a certain amount of I guess, non-aggregating or non-medical support for mental, well-being, because we don't want to necessarily know that, wait a second, this seems like an awful coincidence that there's so many people suffering from this type of stress that we can actually sort of, like, see the numbers. And we can see it creeping up, like that maybe there is a public policy response to this rather than necessarily an individual treatment to everybody or in conjunction with.
Definitely. Like, I think the causes of much of our suffering in society link back to kind of the same things that we always talk about: poverty, inequality. And I think that injecting money into communities, for example, or things like a universal basic income so that people don't feel that they have to either go to work or fall into poverty and potentially become houseless and die. Better working conditions, better labor laws, the ability for people to unionize and improve their conditions of work, which is where most of us spend most of our time. I think these are the things that, I think when we talk about mental distress, we often say, oh, like, what are the other options? Like, how could we have better forms of treatment or healthcare? But for me, healthcare begins at prevention. It begins kind of in our homes, in the streets, in our communities. Like, I think that if we had kind of healthier worlds, or a world that didn't lead so many people to ill health and suffering, like a large number of people that currently engage with, for example, the mental health system might not even get to the point of needing to get to those systems. And I also think things like, the decimation of community under neoliberalism. So many of us are so atomized. We're living in such individual conditions, working in precarious gig economy jobs, things like this. I feel like in many ways it kind of feels almost like too straightforward to kind of say, that suffering, the conditions we live in right now, they cause us to suffer. And I think whether we choose to kind of categorize that as an issue of mental health or just an issue of creating livable lives for people, I think these are the things that we need to be looking towards, kind of prevention and community.
I would love to see, like some type of statistical analysis of, healthcare being a commodity in this country versus in your country, although my understanding is that that's like not going in the right direction. But how much that in and of itself, never mind in terms of like on the care side, but on just the notion of like, I'm worried my kid's going to get sick because I don't have proper health insurance. I don't have access to medical care. How much of a what percentage of just sort of like average stress is a function of just the worrying about something that's been commodified that is a question of mere existence in our society.
Or living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, like
on top of all of those questions. Well, before I do want to get to that era of Reagan and Thatcher, because that to me seems like the biggest shift, one of the biggest shifts, at least in modern times, as to how we deal with this. And in this country, it is creating it is still sort of like created a ripple of social of problems in many respects that were never resolved. Again, it was the 1-2 proposal. We're going to empty out essentially mental hospitals, and we're going to provide resources within the community that are going to help folks. And the second part of that never materialized.
Yeah, I really like how you describe that as kind of, like part one happened and part two didn't. So that's how I talk about it in the book as well, as kind of a partial revolution. And it's something that many patients were arguing for themselves. There was in the UK and in the US, a big kind of mental health service user or they often call themselves psychiatric survivor movements, which were arguing against institutionalization, against forced treatment, kind of against these huge warehouses where people often spent the majority of their lives. But at the same time, you also do see people saying that when these institutions closed, lots of people were basically ejected from brutal institutions into a brutal social and economic climate. So you see lots more people who were categorized as mentally ill becoming houseless or entering the prison system, another system that basically separates and warehouses people who are seen to not be behaving in ways that are useful to capital accumulation. And so, I think when we look back at deinstitutionalization, we can see that in many ways, it was a positive thing. But at the same time, it's not, the revolution doesn't start and end at the institution. We can't only revolutionize institutions or close institutions. We also need to revolutionize the conditions that produce these institutions in the first place. And so I do think that does mean taking on capitalism and creating worlds where people can genuinely have community care. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher called kind of the policy when she closed institutions, she called it care in the community, which is so insidious because it sounds really nice, but actually that community care didn't really materialize for people. And so I think that bigger project surrounding institutions, creating a better world is something much larger that we need to take on.
I mean, you have the final part of your book discusses sort of like other options, and I think sort of some of them are implicit in everything that you've been talking about in terms of like making the world more livable in many respects, and reducing stress by making the world more livable. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in that regard. But what are other some of the sort of the standouts for you? I know you mentioned a program in northern Italy, and there's something called the Crip Theory, I guess. Tell us about ones that stand out for you in terms of like, aside from sort of like broad addressing of people's needs, that maybe more short-term, more specific.
Yeah, I'll choose a few specific standouts. So I look at, like you mentioned, a town called Trieste, which is in the northeast of Italy, where during kind of deinstitutionalization, where it was happening across a lot of Europe and in the US as well, a psychiatrist and also anti-psychiatrist called Franco Basaglia basically pioneered this movement to close the institutions, the asylums in Italy. And there was a system established in Trieste, which had what they call a no locked doors policy, which meant that no one was locked inside. But crucially, it also meant that no one was shut out from accessing mental health care either. So this was kind of a big way in Trieste of addressing, the issue of so many people having mental health crises and being institutionalized was actually, well, what if we didn't have waiting lists? What if you didn't have to go via a doctor to access mental health care? You could just walk into a center in your local community at any hour of the day. And so they have this very consensual approach. And they also have an approach that doesn't have this hard line between the community and between the institution. So, for example, in the UK, and I think it's the same in the US, when you're institutionalized, if you're having a mental health crisis, you're completely shut off from your family. You might not be able to have visitors. You might have to give up your possessions. There are contraband items and things like this. But in Trieste, if you want to bring your pet or you want to bring a family member or something to stay overnight, that's completely allowed. And you find that actually when more kind of consensual and community integrated approaches like this exist, people are actually more likely to engage honestly with mental health systems. There are many people who say, well, I feel like I can't talk to my therapist about like my thoughts of harming myself or harming others because I'm scared that I'm going to be institutionalized in a psychiatric ward if I talk about this, because in the UK I think that's part of the law. And so you see this much kinder system where people are more willing to engage, and also fewer people do kind of enter a really severe mental health crisis in the first place. But I also look at a few other kind of what are called peer support approaches. For example, something called the Hearing Voices Network, which is a global network that tries to take a really depathological approach to experiences that often are diagnosed as psychosis. So, often if you engage with traditional mental health systems and you say, I'm hearing voices, the treatments that you get are going to be very focused on how can we get rid of the symptom. Again, this thing of get you back into work, just reintegrate you into the societal norm. And how do we just shut it down? Whereas the Hearing Voices Network takes this approach of, okay, well, if you're hearing voices, like maybe we should ask the question, what are they saying to you? A lot of people become distressed because their voices are telling them really disturbing things or telling them to harm themselves. So actually, maybe engaging with the content or even speaking back to them might be another way through. Or there are other people who say, through the Hearing Voices Network, I've learned to accept my voices. I've realized I'm never going to be able to get rid of them, or these medications don't work for me, or they give me bad side effects. And I've learned to actually live with them. Or some people say they even enjoy them, they feel like they always have company. And so I think these kind of depathological approaches are really pioneering, and they center kind of people's relationships to their mental health. It's not all about just getting you back into work. And I also look at, something called Mad Pride, which took place in the US and also takes place in the UK, which is a movement a bit like Gay Pride, where people come together and they actually celebrate and say, I'm not ashamed of being mad. I'm proud of my madness. And it's something that I want to embrace as a part of my identity. And so I think that also presents another kind of liberating possibility. And you've also got things in the UK like crisis houses as well, which are kind of residential, a bit similar to Trieste, residential spaces where you can go and stay overnight, but no one's going to forcibly treat you or force you to stay there, or confiscate your items and things like this. And so, yeah, these are a few examples of kind of kinder approaches that also are centered on the individual. They're not these blanket kind of, this is the medication, or we'll put you all in the same place kind of thing. They're very focused on what's right for you. You know, what do you need to heal?
And it seems like, you know, at least the Trieste one, but the others to some extent mirror your discussion of diagnoses. That it is, the diagnoses are very polarizing. It's completely binary, as opposed to maybe some notion of like there's an ebb and flow, and we do these binary diagnoses, and it really is a function of like how well do you function at work. I mean, for the most part, right? And within social circles as well, but ultimately it all sort of leads back to, are you leading a productive life? And the question ultimately becomes, productive for whom, and under what terms?
Just real one on that point, though. I mean, I think that's really important to think about in relation to how the homelessness crisis is dealt with in this country in particular. Like right now, Eric Adams's policy is essentially that police in New York City can take anybody off the street that they perceive as experiencing as a mental health episode and put them in the ER, having our already threadbare healthcare system bear the brunt of it. And the purest form of the stigmatization as a result of capitalism that you describe is in our treatment of the unhoused. I'm not sure how that applies in the UK. But for here, I think that's just important to point out.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's a clearer example of, talking about institutionalization as a means of warehousing people who are seen not to be exploitable, than that Eric Adams policy? And also, I think it touches on a number of things, like what's the best way to address the mental distress of people who are houseless? It's giving them housing. It's a clear example of how a political policy could actually mean that people don't, we argue that they need to be given these treatments or taken, to places where it will retrospectively be remedied. But actually, we could prevent their distress in the first place. And it also raises questions of who's vulnerable to pathologization. If you're houseless and you're in distress, you don't have somewhere to go inside and actually to heal on your own, or to be looked after by a family or a family member or a friend. And I think that's something we see a lot with the Mental Health Act in the UK, which is the legislation that surrounds institutionalization, which is that if you're having a crisis or you're seen to be a person who's mentally ill or mad in public, you're very vulnerable to the police taking you off the streets and incarcerating you.
Yeah, who's privileged enough to be able to have the grace of getting care as opposed to being involuntarily institutionalized? Just something to keep in mind. So
exactly, and it also raises that question again of what is the definition of sanity? Like, how is a houseless person expected not to be depressed or to be anxious about where they're going to sleep at night? Like, I think that to look at these things as individual illness or individual distress really doesn't get to the heart of where suffering comes from.
Micha Frazer-Carroll, columnist at The Independent, author of Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Really interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm. Folks, just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you not only get the free half free of commercials, but you get the fun half, and you can use things like the app at majorityapp.com. It's available to everybody, but you can use it when you're a member to I Am the Show, for instance. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And other things also. AM Quickie, amquickie.com. Get the news in your email box 3 days a week for free. 5 days a week for paid subscribers, but 3 days a week is a great deal anyways. Also, don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. And in the coming days and weeks, I'm gonna get a special for Jazz Daredevil whiskey highballs.
Ooh.
Yeah, I worked out a special deal.
Wow.
Special deal. I've been in high consultations with.
Was it a tough negotiation?
The Jazz Daredevil himself. Yeah, I hit his helmet.
I mean,
that's what I did.
Seems only right.
Emma, what's happening on ESVN?
We'll talk about the U.S. women's national team loss, the right-wing freak out today. I also want to review the Netflix quarterback series because it's pretty incredible. And breaking news, a minority owner of the Texans has been charged with rape. So we will be talking about that and NFL rookies to watch. YouTube.com/ESPN show today at 4 p.m.
Matt, Left Reckoning.
This weekend for Left Reckoning patrons, Dave and I talked about the scandal with regards to Texas A&M sort of weakening a offer of a job to a professor from University of Texas because it turned out she was a black woman who had written for the New York Times and was very into DEI, supposedly. Ooh. And the texts from the Board of Regents members who were upset with it have leaked, and it's very interesting to look at the makeup of the type of guys. Because if I asked ChatGPT to make up 3 bios for conservative Regents members, it would be a car salesman, a petroleum industry guy, and a Deloitte consultant. And these are the 3 guys who are texting saying, hey, I thought we wanted to start a journalism program to get to plant conservatives in the discourse.
We're planning to talk about this tomorrow as well.
Oh, good.
And also there was another story, sort of like a current one that of
another A&M professor
who was fired presumably because she was critical of the lieutenant governor. Now, you've probably heard this from all of the people who are really concerned about free speech.
Oh, Barry Weiss is all over this.
It's one thing to defend moderation on platforms about Nazism and fake medical information, essentially. But it's another
criticize local
government and you get fired. I mean, that's
because literally one of I don't know if it was Patrick or Abbott or which one of those guys, but one of their like a relative or like a friend of the family.
No, it was Dan Patrick.
Dan Patrick, right? Yeah, was in attendance and said, "Hey, this person said you weren't handling the opioid crisis very well," which a surprise, they're not.
And it was a professor who covers addiction or whose specialty is addiction.
Yeah, woke you.
But she get a little political when she's making assessments of policy.
I mean, don't go there.
Snowflakes.
Sounds like wokeness.
Folks, 646-257-3920 is the phone number. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflakes has what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Denner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Denner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense.
See white people doing drugs that look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100.
Can't knock the hustle.
Come on, fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy. I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the fun half. Heavy breathing Steven. Hey, Sam, you always let Emma and Matt talk about their podcasts. I'm just wondering why you never plug your podcast. Are you ashamed of it?
You should plug your podcast on your podcast.
Seb Gorka's back pain. Thanks for the great interview today. I have struggled with depression for years, and for the past week, I've been debating checking myself into my local behavioral health ward due to feeling like a complete failure and other such thoughts. However, I don't know if I can properly explain it to my boss or get work shifts covered. This interview, all of you guys, make me feel like I'm less alone. It's a big problem, and there shouldn't be that kind of stigma attached to it. And my heart goes out to you, and good luck. I don't know if I have much advice.
Yeah. There's so much that capitalism gets us to internalize that's like wrongful shame or needless shame, like including about our financial situation, seeking help for healthcare and things like that. It's really hard you can even acknowledge those things as dynamics. And then when it comes to yourself personally, it's easy to be hard on yourself, but we're here for you.
Her story gels a lot with the data you see, particularly with students. And like the longer you go to higher education, particularly in this country, I know like you're depressed. And I can't help but feel like part of that is the amount of debt people take on. You look at like the White House, I think it was, said, or maybe it was the Department of Education said, if you feel suicidal, here's a number. And it's like, there's a certain number of people who are going to feel suicidal in that kind of debt. Like, that's just what debt does. This has been studied to death. And to act like there's some sort of just reach out. No, we need to actually do policy that's not, to use Sam's metaphor, making the ground harder on people.
Bryce from Arizona, I can tell you right now, I will not read all of this. It is just too long. We only have another hour and 15 minutes to the show. But I will read the first couple of sentences. Hello, Sam and crew. You may be tired of this topic. Based upon the length of the comment, I'm going to bet that we are, but go ahead. But I believe after the appearance of Ryan Grimm on the show to discuss the COVID-19 lab leak hypothesis, there is a very real need for you to have someone on the show who can represent the scientific evidence that essentially rules out the possibility of a lab origin. Now, Here's the problem with doing that. Like, we corrected some of the things that Ryan said that were, clearly unestablished. There is competing theories about, whether there were people who came from that military games that got that had COVID. A lot of them, when they got back to their countries, felt that they had COVID. There is no, as far as I know, epidemiological evidence that they had COVID. Wasn't necessarily the easiest thing to find, after the fact, but there is no evidence. But as far as I know, in all the scientists I've read, okay, because you say, I believe the MR is one of the most reasonable and grounded news shows, and I hope you'll fulfill this duty to your audience properly, represent the more supported theory. There is no evidence that essentially, as you say, rules out the possibility of a lab origin. Right? There's no conclusion.
Well, there's a difference between lab origin and lab leak, right? Those are two different things. Lab origin are they implying like it was created in some kind of lab, or lab leak? Like...
No, I think that it came from a lab.
Right.
I mean, the language is, imprecise in this instance, but as far as I know, people say there is a possibility it could have been leaked from a lab, but the probability, there is a high probability that it was the thing with the zoo, like not actually from a zoo, but I can't pronounce that name. Zoonotics, yes. And so even as you ask me to set the record straight, as far as I have been, read, and the thing is that I don't know that we do a value about it either way at this juncture. I mean, we were very clear on the show with Ryan Grimm that there was the preponderance of the evidence says it's zoonotic, that there is no actual evidence of it being a lab leak. There's circumstantial evidence, but no non-circumstantial evidence. I think everyone, as far as I can tell, agrees that there's no way to know 100% sure, but that the preponderance of the evidence is that it's zoonotic. I don't know, keep relitigating it is not going to add to that. I'm happy to, when it comes up and someone says the lab leak theory, unless there's new evidence, say, this is what the state of the science is right now. High probability that it was zoonotic. A remaining possibility that it was, it came out of a lab, but unlikely based upon